The blade did not feel cold. It felt like a line of fire being drawn across the throat by a demon painter. It was October 16th in the year 1929, and the night air in Staten Island tasted like salt and impending death. Charles Luciano was on his knees. The mud soaked into his expensive trousers, but he did not care about the suit anymore. He only cared about the 3 men standing over him and the 1 man holding the knife. They were not just men. They were messengers. They were the blunt instruments of the old world sent to carve a lesson into the flesh of the new. The man with the knife grabbed Charles by the hair. He yanked the head back. The neck was exposed. A perfect canvas for brutality. "You think you are a king," the man whispered. His breath smelled of cheap wine and garlic. "You are nothing but a street rat in a fancy suit." The blade dug in. It was not a quick slash. It was slow, deliberate. They wanted him to feel every fiber of muscle separating. They wanted him to hear the wet, tearing sound of his own windpipe being threatened. Blood sprayed out in a hot, arterial mist. It painted the shoes of the attacker. It splashed onto the wet gravel. The pain was white and blinding, but Charles did not scream. He refused to give them that satisfaction. He choked on his own blood. He gagged on the iron taste of mortality. "Tell the devil that the old bosses sent you," the attacker sneered. They beat him then. They kicked his ribs until the bones snapped like dry twigs. They pistol whipped his face until his right eye was swollen shut and his cheekbone was shattered. They left him in a heap of bloody rags by the warehouse docks. They laughed as they walked away. They wiped their blades on their handkerchiefs and lit cigarettes. They were confident. They were arrogant. They believed they had just killed the most dangerous ambition in New York City. But they made a mistake, a fatal error that would change the history of crime forever. They did not check his pulse. Charles Luciano lay in the dark. The blood pooled around his head like a dark halo. His throat was cut from ear to ear. His face was a ruin. But inside that broken body, a heart still hammered against the cage of his ribs. 1 beat, 2 beats. He dragged air into his lungs through a curtain of red fluid. He did not die. He refused to die. The humiliation burned hotter than the wound. They had treated him like garbage. They had left him for the rats. He began to crawl. Inch by agonizing inch, he dragged himself toward the road. Every movement was a scream of agony. But the hate fueled him. The hate was a drug. He would survive this. And when he stood up again, he would not just be Charles. He would be Lucky. And he would be the last thing they ever saw. In the underworld of New York, survival was not about muscle. It was about perception. If a man could be cut open and left for dead without consequence, he was finished. His territory would be divided. His earners would be poached. His name would become a punchline in every speakeasy from Brooklyn to the Bronx. The year was 1929, and the Castellamarese War was brewing. It was a war between the Mustache Petes, the Old Guard, Joe Masseria, and Salvatore Maranzano. These men were relics. They believed in honor and provincial loyalty. They killed only Sicilians. They did business only with their own kind. They looked at men like Luciano and saw traitors because Luciano did business with Jews and Irishmen. Luciano saw the future. He saw syndicate, a national corporation of crime where bloodshed was bad for business and profits were the only religion. But the old bosses stood in the way, and now one of them had ordered his death. The scar on his neck would heal into a jagged rope of tissue. The drooping right eye would become his trademark. But the message was clear. If Luciano did not strike back, he was already dead. The streets were watching. The cops were watching. The wolves were circling. He had to rewrite the laws of the jungle. The penalty for humiliation was not just death. It was exterminated. He did not just want to kill the men who cut him. He wanted to kill the system that created them. He wanted to tear the crown off the head of the old king and melt it down into bullets. The hospital room was dark. The curtains were drawn. The smell of antiseptic could not mask the smell of fury. Luciano sat up in bed. His face was bandaged. His voice was a rasp, a gravelly whisper forcing its way past the stitches in his throat. Meyer Lansky sat in the corner. Bugsy Siegel stood by the door, cleaning his fingernails with a switchblade. Frank Costello leaned against the wall smoking. These were not just associates. They were the architects of the new order. "Who did it?" Lansky asked quietly. His eyes were cold behind his glasses. Luciano touched the bandage on his neck. "It does not matter who held the knife," he rasped. "It matters who sent them. It was Masseria, or maybe Maranzano. It makes no difference. They are both dead men walking." He looked at Siegel. The handsome hitman smiled. It was a smile devoid of warmth. "I want them all," Luciano said. His voice broke, but his command was absolute. "I want the men in the car. I want the driver. I want a lookout. And then I want the bosses. We are going to wipe the slate clean. No more old ways. No more Sicilian honor. Just business." He laid out the plan. It was not a gang war. It was a purge. It was a surgical removal of cancer. They would use the element of surprise. The old bosses expected a frontal assault. They expected loud noises and drive-by shootings. Luciano would give them silence. He would give them betrayal. He would use their own arrogance against them. "Find the men who cut me," Luciano ordered. "Make it slow. Make them wish they had finished the job." The hunt began at midnight. It was a countdown of corpses. The first target was the driver of the car. He was found in a brothel in Little Italy. He was asleep in the arms of a woman when the door was kicked in. Bugsy Siegel did not use a gun. Guns were too impersonal for this. He used a length of piano wire. The driver woke up gasping as the wire tightened around his throat. It bit into the skin just as the knife had bitten into Luciano. The man clawed at his neck, his eyes bulging in terror. Siegel whispered into his ear, "Lucky sends his regards." The wire snapped tight. The struggle ended. The body went limp. They left him in the bed with a single white carnation stuffed into his mouth. A funeral flower for a dead fool. The second man was the one who had held Luciano down. He was a brute of a man, a legitimate giant. They caught him in an alley behind a butcher shop. 3 of Luciano's men held him down. They did not kill him immediately. They broke his hands first. The sound of the hammer hitting the knuckles echoed off the brick walls. Crack, crack. The man screamed until his voice gave out. "You like to hold people down," one of the hitmen asked. "Try holding a spoon now." They finished him with an ice pick to the heart. It was quick and clean and left almost no blood. They propped his body up against the trash can, sitting upright, as if he were waiting for a bus. The third man, the man with the knife, the artist who had drawn the line of fire. He was the prize. They found him eating dinner with his family. It was a Sunday. Luciano had no respect for the sanctity of the Sunday meal anymore. Not for these animals. They waited until he left the house. They snatched him off the street and threw him into the back of a sedan. They took him to the same beach on Staten Island. the same spot where Luciano had bled. The man begged. He cried. He offered money. He offered names. Luciano stepped out of the shadows. He wore a high collar to hide the bandages, but the scar was visible, a jagged reminder of the debt owed. He looked at the man who had tried to murder him. The man's eyes widened in horror. He thought he was looking at a ghost. "You, Luciano," he stammered. "You are dead." Luciano said, "But I came back, just for you." Luciano nodded to his men. He did not touch the man himself. He stood and watched as they beat him. He watched as they used the knives. He watched until the tide came in and washed the blood away. Justice was not about fairness. It was about balance. And the scales were finally even. The bodies were just a prologue. The real targets were the kings. Joe Masseria was the first of the old lions to realize that the jungle had changed. He sat in his fortress surrounded by guards, but he could smell the fear. His captains were disappearing. His rackets were being raided not by the police, but by phantom crews that vanished into the night. He tried to call a meeting. No one came. The phone lines were dead. The silence was deafening. Masseria raged. He pounded the table. He screamed about loyalty and tradition. But loyalty was a currency he could no longer afford. Luciano had bought the loyalty of Masseria as own men. He had promised them a future of wealth and stability. Masseria could only offer them a grave. The paranoia set in. Masseria stopped sleeping. He saw assassins in every shadow. He tasted poison in every cup of wine. He was a fat spider trapped in his own web, waiting for the wasp to arrive. Then came the day, April 15th in the year 1931. The countdown reached 0 for Joe the boss. Luciano invited Masseria to lunch, a peace offering, a card game. They went to Nuova Via Tamaro, a seafood restaurant in Coney Island. The restaurant was empty, just the two of them and the bodyguards, who were secretly on Luciano payroll. They ate pasta. They drank wine. They played cards. Masseria relaxed. He thought he had won. He thought Luciano was submitting. He laughed loud and wet, wiping tomato sauce from his chin. "I have to take a leak," Luciano said, standing up. He walked to the bathroom. He washed his hands. He looked at himself in the mirror. The scar on his neck throbbed. He dried his hands slowly. Behind him in the dining room, the doors burst open. It was not a fight. It was an execution. Bugsy, Siegel, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, and Albert Anastasia walked in. They were the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in pinstripe suits. Masseria looked up from his cards. He held the ace of diamonds in his hand, the death card. He saw the guns. He saw the cold eyes of the new generation. He realized too late that the lunch was his last supper. He didn't even have time to stand up. The roar of the revolvers filled the room. Boom, 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 boom. Bullets tore into Masseria's chest. They shattered the wine bottles on the table, red wine mixed with red blood. The fat boss was thrown back in his chair. He groaned. His eyes rolled back. He slumped forward, his face landing on the plate of half-eaten pasta. Luciano walked out of the bathroom. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of cordite. He walked over to the body. He looked down at the man who had ruled New York for a decade. Now he was just meat. Luciano picked up his hat. He didn't check the pulse. He didn't need to. "One down," he said. "One to go." Salvatore Maranzano was next. He declared himself the boss of bosses. He thought he had used Luciano to kill Masseria, and now he was the emperor. He planned to have Luciano killed next. He hired an Irish hitman named Vincent Mad Dog Call. But Luciano was faster. He was always faster. September 10th, in the year 1931. Luciano sent 4 men to Maranzano's office in the Helmsley building. They were Jewish gangsters disguised as government tax agents. They walked past the guards. They flashed their badges. Maranzano stood up to greet them smiling, thinking he could bribe his way out of a tax audit. The agents drew knives and guns. They pinned Maranzano against the wall. He fought like a tiger, but he was old, and they were young and hungry. They stabbed him repeatedly. Then they shot him to make sure. Maranzano slid down the wall, leaving a smear of bright red. The boss of bosses was dead. The era of the mustache Pete's was over. When the smoke cleared, there was no celebration. There was only business. Luciano called a meeting in Chicago. He gathered the heads of all the major crime families. He stood at the head of the table. He did not wear a crown. He wore a tailored suit and a silk tie. He looked at the men around the table. Al Capone was there. The toughest men in America were there. And they all looked at Luciano with a mixture of fear and awe. They looked at the scar on his neck. They knew the story. They knew he was the man who came back from the dead to kill his killers. "We are not a gang anymore," Luciano told them. "We are an organization. We are a commission. No more boss of bosses. We vote, we earn, we survive." He had created the modern mafia. He had turned chaos into commerce. Luciano sat down. He lit a cigarette. The smoke curled up around his face, hiding the drooping eye, hiding the scar. He was the victor. He was the king of New York. But he would never forget the feeling of that knife on his throat. He would never forget the cold, wet sand of Staten Island. It was the lesson that made him. It was the scar that defined him. Charles Lucky Luciano died an old man in exile, not by a bullet, but by a heart attack at an airport. But for 50 years, he was the architect of American organized crime. He built an empire on the foundation of his own blood. So I ask you, the reader, as you sit in the safety of your home, was this justice? When a man is cut and left to die, does he lose his humanity in the pursuit of revenge? Or does he simply become what the world forces him to be? Luciano wiped out an entire generation of gangsters to save himself. He brought order to chaos through extreme violence. In the dark history of the world, perhaps the monsters are necessary. Perhaps the only way to defeat the devil is to become a bigger devil yourself. What would you do if they held the knife to your throat? Would you die quietly, or would you return to burn the world down?